network, and I have a very interesting story to tell you today with a guest, Michelle Peterson. She is a middle American mother based in Illinois, and she is one of those people that just got tired of being the silent majority. Her story starts with a really interesting case of her son who was being targeted by a high school teacher for sexual grooming. And Michelle found it out, unfortunately, uh, after it had gone on for quite some time. She's going to tell us her story today. As a result of everything that happened, she has become an activist and she is actively working to get laws passed and changed in this country to help other families, other parents, and other kids. Michelle, welcome to the show. You're on Grace Time. Good to have you here.
Hi, thank you for having me. I feel very blessed to be able to share this story with you. And it's a story that kind of started off not so good, but God's hand has been all over it. And we actually are getting some good things out of this story now and what happened to my son and our family.
Good, that's great. We're going to show a quick video here just to give our listeners a recap of what happened with your son, and then we're going to jump right in and see where things are today.
Thank you.
My producer, which is me, is going to switch everything around here. Hold on. No, that's not what we want. Let's see. Okay, hold on. Here we go.
Always the case.
And there we go.
The story unfolded here in Morris, southwest of Chicago, as middle America as it comes.
He wanted to make a sex video, put it straight out there.
Andrew Kozik says he had begun texting Stefan Belegno, a teacher here at Morris High School, because he was having trouble on the baseball team. But before long, he says Belegno was offering him money for oral sex.
It started off at $500 and then $1,000 and then $1,500.
But Andrew never told anyone, and no one knew until his mother heard him talking to Belegno on the phone.
He has no business calling you at 11 o'clock at night. That's completely inappropriate.
When she learned the two had been communicating by text message, Andrew's mother went to her computer and logged into the family's account. She found thousands of messages.
I was just sick because I knew in my heart, I'm like, this isn't just regular text messaging.
The family went to police, who searched Andrew's phone and found nearly 6,000 messages between the two. But only about a tenth of those could be recovered. And indeed, they are troubling. We can't read some of the more graphic messages, but among the more benign, the teacher writes, "When does the kissing begin?" "Icky," the student says. "How about if we just go at it and not video it?" the teacher declares. And on another occasion, "When you're 18, we can give each other everything."
Sometimes males to bond with males are crude.
Raymond Wigel is Belegno's lawyer. He insists the teacher was only trying to help Andrew through a bullying incident on the baseball team.
You say that these text messages do not indicate criminal activity. They certainly indicate stupidity for a teacher to be sending these messages.
Absolutely.
Wigel says he and his client concede bad judgment, but they point to the thousands of other texts no one read, as well as huge gaps in the transcripts.
There's a stupid intent, but there was not an evil intent to have sex with this young man.
I don't care what context you put it in. When you offer somebody money for sex, that's solicitation.
So why didn't Andrew tell someone? Records show at one point he even told a DCFS investigator the teacher's messages had not crossed the line.
Why'd you tell him?
I didn't want him to lose his job. I didn't want him to get in trouble.
Belegno was found guilty of indecent solicitation of a minor and unlawful grooming. He is to be sentenced next month.
I want him to have to register as a sex offender. The jail time would just be icing on the cake.
Michelle Peterson says she and her son wanted to talk to us to stress the importance of reporting incidents like this. 18 of these texts were after midnight, 15 after 3 a.m. The Grundy County State's attorney says he believes it's a cautionary tale about giving children digital technology this Christmas without firm guidelines on how it will be used.
Okay. Wow. So that's quite a story.
Right.
And this was just to give us the time frame. This is not super recent, but quite
No.
relevant to what we're
Yes.
seeing happening right now. So when this happened, we found out that the teacher in question was convicted, sentenced. Uh, everybody's wanting to know the outcome of that. So tell us that, and then let's just bring us up to date on what's going on now.
Okay. So when this first started, this was back in 2010, and he started texting my son in May of 2010. In October of 2010, I overheard a conversation, and it tipped me off that he was speaking to an adult and a teacher. He had said, how often you want me to call you? You know that I'm busy. I'm taking a couple of classes and working a couple of jobs. And he was a junior in high school at the time. So in that video, he was 19 because this is at the end of everything that happened. When he first started texting my son, he was 15 going on 16. And then in that same conversation, I heard him say, well, I'll meet you in your classroom tomorrow to pick up those paintballs. And so I just went straight to the computer then and started looking up the phone number that he was just speaking to, and then went to the text messages and saw thousands of messages between the two of them. So I, though, looked at my son's phone all the time. I would take his phone intermittently throughout the week, 3 or 4 times a week, and I never saw one of over 6,000 messages, because as soon as the message would come in, he would delete it. And so I think that's one of the things to tell the parents, is to make sure that they're checking their kids' technology, their phones. There is now an app that they can put on their phones that will show the messages coming in and out of their children's phone. It's called a Bark app. So they can put that app on both of their phones, and they can set it up for different keywords, body parts, slang, cuss words, that sort of thing. So they're not getting every single message that goes in and out, but then this way, at least they can see the messages. And the other thing that I wish I would have done was taken my son's phone at night when he went to bed. I would have seen those messages coming in at night then, and we wouldn't have been going through so much, on the backside of all of this. So, but it was a struggle. It was 3 years of trying to get the state's attorney's office to actually prosecute this guy. They just wanted me to go away. It was, one thing after another, and trying to find somebody to get the messages off the phone was the biggest thing. And I found a detective in another county over who, that's what he did. He would get the messages off the phone, and iPhone had just done an upgrade. And so they wouldn't help them. They don't have to help these officers get the messages off the phone without a court order. And prior to that, I told my son that I needed his phone, and said that, I found somebody to get the messages off the phone. And at that point, his face kind of went green, because he had kept denying that there was anything, wrong with the messages between the two of them. And I said, if there's something you need to tell me. And he said, no, but I'll tell the principal and the detective tomorrow. So he ends up telling them everything that was in that video. The principal then said, they're going to open up their own DCFS investigation, because I had started one already. And he said, Andrew wants to tell you what's going on himself. And if you come back later, I'll still be here if you have any questions. So my son told me about the video, and then he'd also refer to his penis as my little guy. Am I ever going to get to see the little guy? That sort of thing. And so I went back to the principal and talked to him. He asked what he had told me, and I told him. He said, well, he didn't even tell you the worst of it, where he offered him money for oral sex. And so that's when I found out about that. And so once we took the phone to the detective to try to get the messages off the phone, he couldn't get them off of there. So they ended up taking the phone to the Illinois State Police. They had his phone for at least 4 or 5 months. And this is probably a year into all of this already. Once my son told them what the messages entailed, they did put the teacher on paid administrative leave at that point. So he, at this point, was, he wasn't teaching, thankfully. And the state police, like I said, had his phone for 4 or 5 months, couldn't get the messages off the phone, they said. And I went and met with one of my friends. Her husband was a Secret Service agent at the time, and he got me connected with another Secret Service agent who was on a pedophile task force. And he said, Michelle, they just want you to go away. He said, you need to kind of keep going in there, stay in their face, let them know that you're an educated woman, you're not going away. And he was going to give you 2 business cards. You keep one for yourself, you give one to the state's attorney's office, and you tell them if they don't have the messages off that phone in 7 days, that you're going to turn this over to the feds. He goes, I'll have them off of there in 15 minutes. So I did that, and they had the messages back in 3 days, which leads me to believe that they were probably sitting on those messages. Yeah. So
there's so many things about this that I mean, I don't want to interrupt you. I do want to say one thing to my listeners. There is a little bit of distortion coming through on Michelle's sound. uh, for some reason, some of the audio issues that I have had and troubleshooted months ago are starting to come back. We can probably all guess why. So I just appreciate all of your patience. I can hear her fine. I think that we're going to push through this because this is an important topic, and there are some things coming up in the next few days that my listeners up in the Chicago or in the Illinois area are going to want to know about. So we're just going to push through. I appreciate everybody's patience. And I also want to remind all of my listeners that when you are watching these shows, that we are listener supported. And so when you come to my show, it is important that you apologize, that you go to my website, go to marygracemedia.com and click on the shopping tab and find all of my affiliate partners there. We have a partnership with mypillow.com, promo code Mary Grace. We have partnerships with 2 different gold and silver advisors who can help you to move your retirement accounts into gold and silver and to protect your money. We also have a wellness store. We have a superfood store. There's a lot there. And these are America First companies. So I want to make sure that you know that you have access to these things. And whenever you purchase from them, it supports the show. The other thing is when I do a show, I send out an email. When I put up a show, when I live stream, you're going to get an email if you go to that website and join my email list. So back to our programming here. Michelle, this is just a fascinating, uh, heartbreaking story, but also there are good parts to it because you stopped this from happening before it did. Now, I want to
Absolutely.
focus on a couple of key things before we go into the law enforcement piece. One is that when you asked your son about what was going on, he said that he was worried about the teacher. He was worried about getting him fired and getting him in trouble. And
Hmm.
this is something that I think that parents, I think it's a struggle all around because what I do know is that most children who are abused know their abuser. And the reason that it is so easy for the adult to get what they want is because they build trust with the child. And there is a lot of emotional manipulation involved. In some cases, that person has learned it from somebody that abused or groomed them. And
Hmm.
so there are different levels of emotion that come into play with trafficking and things like that as well. So what would you recommend to parents? What kind of conversations would you recommend to give children a heads up and permission to get the teacher in trouble, or
Right.
to out them to come forward when it's necessary?
Right. I would say just making sure you're having open conversations with your children and letting them know that no matter what has ever happened, if somebody's telling you to keep a secret or wants you to keep something secret, you know that that's probably not a good thing and that they will never get in trouble for that. My son and I had a very close, open relationship. So I was floored when he never told me about any of this, and I think he was just embarrassed. He wanted it to go away. I think he thought once I found out, it would just go away. And that's not what happened because it wasn't, at that point, it was no longer about us anymore. It was about the next kid. And the something he was texting my son, there's no way he was the first one. So I
Yeah.
was having this feeling like if somebody would have taken care of this before us, we wouldn't be going through this.
Mhm.
And trying to get my son to understand that because at one point he really didn't want to do anything about it. And I kind of pulled on his heartstrings, just like the teacher did. I said, well, what about the 3 boys across the street and the 4 down the street? What if something happens to one of them? How do you face their parents knowing that you could have taken care of that? And sent him to bed that night. And it was one of the longest nights. And I was watching over him, because you have to have these conversations too, that no matter what comes of all of this, that I still love him. And
Mhm.
that, I had to have, discussions with him about suicide, that none
Yeah.
of that is ever worth this. I had to talk to him too about if the teacher were to do anything to himself, that's not on him either. So these were open conversations we were having, and then also getting him into counseling. And I want people to realize that grooming is normal, right? You groom your children to be good, moral people. You groom people to be CEOs of a company. But this is unlawful grooming. This is where somebody is trying to gain the trust of another person and trying to do something nefarious to them. And this guy, when people are good at grooming, they groom not only the child, they groom the family, they groom the community. Like the entire school was just baffled that this is what this guy was doing because he groomed them as well. The principal told me when I went in there the first time that he actually had just given him a teaching award 2 weeks prior to that. He would volunteer for everything. He was helpful, and he would like the principal at one point. He sat back the first time and he's like, "There's a couple kids, and I'm just wondering now." He had given a laptop to one of the kids who didn't have enough money to get a laptop for home, those types of things. And so those are things you want to watch for too. I mean, my son was withdrawn. He wasn't sleeping. He was irritable. He didn't want to go to school. He never went to the nurse, and the nurse was calling me like every other week. He's down here with a resting heart rate of 120, and I ended up taking him to a cardiologist to check his heart out to make sure that was okay. So all of these things kind of added up, and then overhearing that conversation. So then I knew that that's what was going on. And even then, like I got him into some counseling, and my son is very smart, and he told the counselor everything he wanted to hear, so he'd discharge him. So he never, got the real counseling that he needed. I kept telling the counselor, like, he's not fine. So all of that, and just making sure that you really just kind of hone in on what your kid's normal behavior is, and just really keeping watch. Like I said, I checked his phone all the time. Never saw any of these messages. So I think that's the most disheartening thing. But the saving grace, I think, in our whole story was the principal at the school. After all this was going on for such a long time, it was well over a year, and he calls me into the school and he said, "Listen, I've been trying to tell the state's attorney's office to come down and get his personnel file because there's things in there they're going to want to see." And so I go to the state's attorney's office and I asked, is there any chance you can subpoena the personnel file? And he said, "Well, what could possibly be in there that we would need?" And I said, "Well, what skin is it off of your back to just get it?" So they end up getting the subpoena for the personnel file. The attorneys at the school wouldn't give them the personnel file until I came in and actually signed off on it and used the HIPAA law, because my son was a minor and his name was all over this chart, or the file. So I read everything that was in there, and the principal had been a counselor before, and he asked him straight up, and the superintendent was in there, the teacher, and the union rep. And he said, "Did you ever offer Andrew money for oral sex? Did you ever want to make a sex video? And did you ever refer to his penis as my little guy?" And he said he put his head down, shook his head in affirmation, and said yes. So I'm like, well, we got him, right? So I sign off on it. I go to the state's attorney's office, tell him what was in there. And he said, "Well, why'd they let you see it?" And I said, "Because of the HIPAA law." He's like, "Well, they didn't have to do that." And I said, "Well, I'm pretty sure that they did this because they knew the trouble I was having down here with you, and that if I didn't see what was in there before it got to you, I would never know what was in there. So now that I do, I expect you to have this guy arrested within the next 7 days. I'm going to have every major news station on your front lawn." And he waited the full 7 days before he indicted him. So it was like one hurdle after another. And then we were going status hearing after status hearing after status hearing every month. Nothing was really going forward. And then in January of 2013, we had voted in a new state's attorney. Our detective went to him and said, "Hey, there's 2 cases that you need to work on. They've been hanging out there for a while, and ours was one of them." And so he meets with us, and he met with me and my son and my husband, who is my son's stepfather. And he said, "At this point, I think we might have to take a plea deal. It's been 2.5 years, and there's a lot of gaps in the transcripts. I'm afraid that they won't be able to remember. There's going to be too much question, right?" So we end up agreeing to take the plea deal, go to court in August of 2013. And by the grace of God, this teacher says that he wants to take it to trial. And the judge on the case lit him up and lit up his attorney for dragging this out for 2.5 years. And we could have gone to trial that summer while my son was home from school because he was going to school out of state. And so then we end up meeting with the state's attorney and his first assist after this happened. And the first assist said, hey, there's a new law that came into play in Illinois in July. So just the month before, a grooming law became effective in Illinois. He said everything that he did to your son, to your family, to the community is in this grooming law. We're going to go after that, but there's no other grooming conviction in the United States. So it's going to be difficult to get. So there's no precedent set. So we go to court in October of that year, and we get a conviction of solicitation of a minor and unlawful grooming. So we end up with the very first grooming conviction in the United States. Now, fast forward to January a year ago, I go to one of the Reawaken events in Nashville. I meet a sex trafficking investigator, and her name is Amy Coelho, and she's out of Texas. She was telling me about a couple of cases she was the lead investigator on. One of them was the La Luz de Mundo case out of California, and this was a church cult, and it ended up being cartel, and they busted 123 different sex trafficking cells between Mexico and California. And then she told me about another case. It was one of the clients was a Larry Nassar gymnast out of Michigan State.
I was just thinking.
Yeah. And then she told me about another couple other high profile cases. And so I'm going to tell her about my case here in Illinois. You know, I literally said my measly little case here in Illinois. And I start to tell her, and she goes, hold on, are you from Illinois? And I said, yes. And she said, when was that? I said, 2013. And she grabbed my arm and she got tears in her eyes. She goes, I need to get a picture with you and send this to my team. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she said, we use your case for every trafficking case we bust because we have to prove the grooming in order to prove the trafficking. And you have the only grooming conviction in the United States. She said, we watched your case in real time. We watched it go up to the appellate court, come back down. And she goes, you have to understand, we just get a file. We don't even know your son's name. We don't know the story behind any of this. And so, because when it's a minor, it's just the initials that go in the case. And so she said, to hear the story and what you went through and the struggle you went through, she goes, I'm going to tell you right now. She goes, your son, his willingness to come forward and your tenacity, you guys have saved thousands of lives. I mean, Mary Grace, I was a ball of goo. I was a hot mess. I was crying. You know, I've been like a lot of moms, I've been going to board meetings and county meetings and all this stuff. And just the week before, I was at a school board meeting, and you know, you get 3 minutes to put all the information that you can. And I felt like I sounded like a complete buffoon. And so the Saturday before this Reawaken event, I'm laying in bed and praying to God and saying, you know, is anything I'm doing making a difference? And then he puts Amy Coelho in front of me and says, here, let me show you how great I am, right? And puts her in front of me. And she then proceeds to tell me that most parents give up and they don't go back. They take no for an answer. She goes, you did the one thing that most parents don't do. Every time you got told no, you came back fighting harder. You get told no, you come back again. And I then asked her, I said, so if they're using our case for trafficking cases throughout the United States, could they have possibly used this with the Ghislaine Maxwell trials? And she said, I'd have to look at the case file because she's also a paralegal. And she's like, but I don't know what else they would have used. So to even think that we could have had a hand in the most prolific pedophile of our time, it's so surreal and overwhelming. But then she also said, she's like, we need to get a law put in place where if somebody's charged with grooming, they can't take a plea deal. So that's what we started to work on at that point. And I met, you know, General Flynn through the Reawakens, and then I met Mary Flynn at the Nashville Reawaken, and they got me introduced to some attorneys and a paralegal out of Florida. And Allie Hopper out of Florida is a paralegal, and her dad is an attorney. And they got connected with some representatives in Florida, presented the grooming law to them because we found out through all of this that Illinois is the only state that has a grooming law. There's a federal grooming law, but no other state has a grooming law. So they started working on that. It went through the Criminal Justice Subcommittee 2 weeks ago and passed in Florida 15-2. Now it has 2 other subcommittees to go through before it would actually get voted on to become law in Florida as well. So that's what we've been working on. And here in Illinois, my representative, Jed Davis, I presented this to him as well. And so he tacked on the verbiage to our grooming law that somebody charged with grooming wouldn't be able to take a plea deal, but also somebody charged with trafficking wouldn't be able to take a plea deal. So he took it a step further. So that's what we're working on here. And Jed's been a huge proponent of this. And we actually have a Freedom Caucus in Illinois, if you can believe that. There's about 7 of them who are Christian conservatives, and they're actually getting behind this entire bill.
It's interesting. I want to comment on the plea deal for our listeners who may not understand how that works. I mean, we assume that people have watched enough Law and Order and shows like that to understand, but basically what that means is that uh, a lot of times, in order to avoid going to trial, a criminal defendant will be offered a lesser sentence or a lesser charge if they will plead guilty. For example, if they know, typically they know the person is guilty and they will offer them, less time, maybe drop one of the charges or something like
Yeah.
that. And a lot of times it's done to save the prosecutor work. It's done to save them, to save the state money, whatever it is. Because in cases like this, it's typically the state against the defendant. And so is that pretty accurate what you're seeing?
Yes.
And the fact that the state's attorney, who was supposed to be representing you and your son, was dragging their feet on this tells me that the issue, well, it could have been a number of things. One, that they were understaffed. Two, that they know that grooming and sex trafficking is like the third rail. I have heard that that is an area that nobody in law enforcement ever wants to touch. They'll go after drug cases, they'll go after all kinds of things except anything having to do with trafficking or grooming. And
Right.
so, and it's interesting because, Kash Patel, who was the, chief of staff for the DoD under President Trump before the end of his last term, he said that the way to get promoted in government is to do something really bad because your superiors your superiors, don't want to be outed, for allowing it to happen. And so they sweep it
Right.
under the rug and promote you. And from what you're telling me that was happening in, your state with the state's attorney, somebody dropped the ball
Hmm.
on this guy, on this teacher, and they didn't want that kind of conviction or publicity on their watch. So
Right.
right? It's just interesting, and so it fascinates me because you think about how many people just get away with it because people in positions of authority don't wanna lose their job. They don't
Right.
want to be they don't want their reputations ruined, by things like this happening on their watch, and so they
Right.
just look the other way, sweep it under the rug, allow it to happen. And you
Yeah.
mentioned the women's gymnastics coach, Larry Nasser. Uh, Apparently, this type of situation really does attract predators. I was recently watching a film about a swimmer, Diana Nyad, who was, who had a a record-breaking swim from Cuba to Florida at the age of, I think, 62. She had attempted it earlier when she was a younger swimmer, and one of the things that they revealed in that film was that she and all of her teammates had been abused
Yep.
consistently over time by their coach.
Yep.
And he it yeah, he basically got away with it. And
Right.
and
I,
so
I
all of
watched the
those
same thing, the same
okay,
movie, and I'm just like, it's so prevalent, but I
yeah,
think we've come to a time now where the kids are speaking up more, the parents are
mhm,
believing the children more because it's been out there so much. Um, the movie Spotlight about the priests, right?
mhm,
So I think that was one of the biggest things that initially was, you know, with the priests coming out and them exposing some of what was going on there, I mean, how hard would it be for a parent to come out against the Catholic Church when,
mhm,
those are people that you're supposed to trust and they're in a position of authority.
yeah,
And that's the same thing with all of these teachers and these
yeah,
coaches. They're in a position of authority and, and then these kids, they feel like they can't trust anybody at that point, so
yeah,
it's difficult, right?
y
And one of the things though that Amy had told me, she said, there's a statistic out there that if parents fight for their children and fight for their rights, 79% of those kids will become a productive member of society. So if
Yeah.
you don't fight for them, most of them won't become a productive member of society. So my biggest message is to everyone, just fight for your children and fight until you can't fight any further, until every door is shut, you know. And I feel
Mm.
like that's what I did, and that God was all over this, even when I couldn't see it, because had we gone to trial even 2 months prior, we wouldn't have had that grooming law, right? And so
Yeah.
now listening to
Yeah.
what God has now put in front of us, and that we need to make this an actual law. And
Mhm.
Amy wanted to call it Andrew's law after my son. And
Wow.
yeah, so it's really, it's crazy and it's surreal. But
Mhm.
doing what you're supposed to do and following your convictions and following what God is asking you to do is just, all these doors are opening. And that's what led to this whole anti-trafficking event with America's Future coming to Illinois and coming to my church this weekend. So this Friday, Saturday, the 26th and 27th of January, if you go to americasfuture.net, you can sign up and register. And on Friday night, we're going to show Mike Smith's movie Into the Light. And General Flynn will be there. Lara Logan is the moderator. There's going to be a whole panel discussion with Tara Lee Rodas, the DHS whistleblower, and Mike Smith, Liz Crokin, and then Tina and Baz Bazell, who are they have an organization called ARC, which is the Association for Recovery of Children, and they do a certification course, which we're going to be holding here in the Midwest. So I think that's March 15th or March 11th through the 15th in Highland, Indiana. So people can get more information about that this weekend as well. And then on Saturday, there'll be classes for healthcare personnel, for police, for fire, EMTs,
Mhm.
another class on, survivors and trying to, how to cope with being a survivor of sexual abuse. So
Yeah.
there's all sorts of things going on this weekend. So if you want to come out and join us, the weather's not supposed to be too bad. It's supposed to be in the 40s. Last week we were minus 20 wind chill.
Eh.
So we've taken about a 60-degree shift in the weather. So
Yeah, we're getting
yeah,
that too. I just so last week I had Tara Rodas and Mary Flynn on the show. We did talk about this event. So it's americasfuture.net is where you go to get the information to register, and that is Friday and Saturday of this coming week. So that's going to be the 26th and the 27th of
yes,
January. So if you're listening to this after the fact and you missed it, please go to americasfuture.net and find out where the next event will be in your area. They are going around the country doing these events. And it
yes,
is really important. If you want to have an event or host an event in your area, contact them through the website, because this is how people are getting the resources and the tools they need to, as parents, as educators, as first responders, as just citizens who want to make a difference in this issue. One thing that comes to mind as you're talking about this, I want to shift back to the dynamic between the children and the adults. A couple of things. One of the things that really gets me is when people say underage girl or underage boy, right? Um, let's just be clear. Anybody that's under the age of 18 in most states, and some it's 16, but who's under the age of consent is a child. So it's not an underage girl that is being victimized. It's a child that is a victim of a
right,
pedophile or groomer. So that is language that is used to sanitize and lessen the impact of what's really happening. I want people to be clear on that. And then the other thing that I think people are starting to realize is when children are little, we teach them stranger danger. And while that's valid in some cases, what we have seen is that it's really not the stranger that
right,
that tends to engage in these types of crimes. It is somebody that knows the child, that has earned the child's trust. And so the conversations that parents should be having with their children are around that, around the topics and behaviors that should be raising red flags with a child. For example, a friend, a caregiver, a teacher, a coach tells you that you have a secret that's a red flag. And these are the types of things that you're going to be talking about as well during the workshops, correct?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because like you said, it's somebody that you know. So I'm a physical therapist, and I was actually doing some home health physical therapy. And I was in this guy's house treating a family member in his home when he started texting my son. I also had played softball in college, and I was coaching at the high school. So the same high school that he was coaching at, I was also coaching. So he knew me on two different levels. I think he thought that I was too busy to know what was going on in my son's life. But like I said, I mean, we talked all the time, and I checked his phone all the time. Like I paid attention to what was going on.
Mhm.
Um, it's just unfortunate that, my son was too embarrassed and felt like he couldn't come forward. Even at 29 now, he said that he would have never told me had I not overheard that conversation. He just literally wanted it to go away. And you
Mhm.
could see there were a bunch of messages coming in, 30 messages, and he would not respond. And then he'd finally feel like he had to respond. So who knows what the message was that came in? Like, if you don't respond to me, I'm going to do this. Who knows, right? And so um,
Wow.
there's all of those things going on too in the mind games. And I mean, our house was just, for 3 years, was just tumultuous. It wasn't a good place to be. It was horrible, and it was like the only thing you could think of every day. This is what's going on in your life. And then you try to muddle through your normal day and still continue to work. And
Mm,
I always say, I'm like, I don't know how people who are going through like murder trials, how they can stay focused and do their normal everyday things, because this was all consuming. And we had, at the same time, the Jerry Sandusky trial was going on with Penn State. The Dennis Hastert stuff was going on here in Illinois. So Dennis Hastert was I think he was a U.S. senator, and he was
mhm.
a wrestling coach. And so he was molesting kids on the wrestling team. Um, and that was all in the news every single day. So it was like in our face all the time. So it was all you could think about. And
Mhm.
it's so prevalent, and you don't even think about it. And the one thing that Amy told me when I met her and we were talking about all of this, she said, Michelle, had he gotten his hands on him, he wouldn't have kept him for himself. He would have trafficked him. And she goes, even if it was only in his little group, he would have trafficked him, because she's like, they work in pods. So she's like, and he wasn't alone. And then come to find out, a couple years later, there was a youth soccer coach that lived in the same town that he did, and they were both on the volunteer fire department in the town that they lived in. And this guy was found guilty of molesting some kids. I think they were under the age of 12, and was convicted. But this teacher was the one who came and bailed this guy out. So yeah, and the gut
Wow.
punch for me was when she said that he would have trafficked him. Like, back then, I wasn't even thinking any of that, right? I was just thinking, hey,
Yeah.
this case is going to help other people who are being groomed. Never in my wildest dreams ever thinking trafficking. Yeah.
And that's interesting that that she told you that. We tend to think of trafficking as, kids being picked up, taken across state lines, uh, put in a brothel, things like that. You don't tend to think of trafficking as a person that the child trusts, taking
Right.
them to their friend's house,
Right.
and having their friend just letting their friend have at it, their friend group or whatever it
Right.
is. That just
Yep.
really brings it all into perspective in a really scary way.
Right.
And it's one thing I do wanna say about this too is we have so much more awareness now, especially because of the internet. People have more access because of the internet, and so it seems it's kind of in our faces, right? And also people are talking about it more, like you said. But the truth is, this has been happening really since the dawn of time, that
Yep.
children have been exploited, whether it's through labor trafficking, sex trafficking. They tend to go hand in hand,
Mm-hmm.
and so this is something that, thankfully, the awareness is coming, and it is something that I believe more people like you need to come forward and take action on, because it's like, like you were told, most people give up. Most people don't
Right.
press the issue. Most people don't keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And it's because of that persistence that God was able to use you to make these changes. And so, what would you say to any parents or caregivers or teachers out there who are seeing things like this happen and maybe feel like, I don't have time, I don't want to get involved, whatever the case is, no one will listen to me. What do you have to say for those people?
I would just say, there's one day you're going to stand before your maker, and I'm more fearful of my God than I
Mm,
am of the person that I'm going to upset that this is about, right? And so I think that's the biggest thing is don't be afraid. 365 times in the Bible, have no fear.
yeah.
So we really truly need to take care of our kids. God wants his children saved. And we as the adults are the ones that have to do that. And we have to give the strength to those kids to be able to come forward to be able to do that. There was a point in my son's life where, he ended up becoming a United States Marine, and he ended up having some issues there because of all of this still going on in the background that he never dealt with. And I told him, I said, you can keep spiraling out of control and everyone they'll feel sorry for you. Poor Andrew, look what happened. I said, or you can use this as a springboard to go forward and become the person that you were supposed to be, that God intended you to be, and be strong in that and use it for something good. So that's what he's now doing. And he wants to become an attorney. He has his undergrad degree in just general studies, and he speaks a couple of languages. And so he's hoping to become an attorney and then be able to help folks who are in the situation like us, because truly we went back to try to do a civil suit against this teacher just to recoup my time off of work and
Mhm.
counseling money, things like that. All three attorneys we spoke to wanted to go after the school because they have deeper pockets. Now, there was no way I was going after that school
Yeah.
because they were the one entity that had our back, and I had to be able to sleep at night. There's no way I was going after that school. And
Mhm.
so none of them would go after the teacher. So, I think that's what he wants to do is be able to help families
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
kids who are in the same
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really, really enlightening, and I definitely I applaud you for what you're doing, and especially after the fact, right? You could be saying, "Well, my we got through it. My child is okay." But clearly God has a bigger call on your life, and you're answering that call. And one of the things that we do on this channel is we're constantly highlighting the way that God brings people into their calling and their destiny. And so many times the common theme that we see in this is everybody has a choice. God has a destiny on your life. It's not really complicated. It's just a question of whether you're willing to participate in the path that he has for you. And
Right.
it doesn't mean it's easy. It just means that, if you're following his steps and you're following his word and you're resting in his goodness, it's not complicated, right? You
Right.
know what you need to do.
Right.
It's just a question of persevering and holding on to the truth day in and day out.
Yes.
That's the hard part, right?
Right.
But you're continuing to do it, and God is putting other people in your path who are locking arms with you and linking arms, and one by one, step by step, state by state, you're making a difference. So I really want to applaud you. Before we
Thank you.
sign off here, last words to our listeners.
Just do what God is asking you to do. Stand true in your faith and fight for our kids. That's the biggest thing because they're coming after our children. So,
Thank you. For more on this story, you can go to Michelle's website, michellepeterson.org. You're also on social media. Where can they follow you there?
so I'm on Twitter. I think it's Michelle Pete 77
Okay.
on X now, right? So
Yeah.
but I think that's what it is. And
Okay.
on my website, it has the social media on there as well. And I also have a Rumble channel, just a few videos on there, but it's Freedom Meetup on Rumble, all one word.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you again for being here. And before we go, I just
Thank
want to
you.
remind my listeners one last time, please go to my website, marygracemedia.com, click on shop, and support our affiliate partners on my website. This is so important to allow us to continue bringing you the content that we do, to keep the lights on, to keep the internet on, to travel, and to do all of the events that we do here at the show. Go to marygracemedia.com and support our affiliate partners right over there. Everybody have a great day, and we will see you again soon right here at GraceTime TV. Thank you again, Michelle, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.